Hi, my name is Christopher Loewen, and next to me there is my father, Karl Josef Loewen. So we are doing together the winery Karl Loewen in the Mosel Valley, and we are located in the city of Loewen. And yeah, we focus mainly on the production of Riesling from old vines.
Excellent. Let's talk about the 2019 vintage. We were able to get to Germany and taste through some of the other regions, but we haven't tasted in the Mosel or in Rheinhessen. So if you could talk a little bit about what the winter was like, spring, flower, and then into flowering, and then the vegetative cycle, and up and through harvest, that would be really helpful.
All right. So starting talking about the 2019 vintage with the winter first, as you mentioned. So the winter itself was quite dry. We had a quite wet start of the winter, but when it got more into the time of the vegetation period, it got more and more dry. So the start of the year was quite good. The vines started growing very well. The flowering was doing quite well. Let me know if you have any gluten is good. And so the bunches per vine were quite normal. And then the summer was again a quite dry summer. So it was a little bit a comparison in the summer to 2018, honestly. It was also quite dry, but the big difference is that in 2017 to 18 vintage, the winter was quite wet. So there was a big amount of water supply in the soil, so that the vines could grow in the start of 2018 vintage very well. And that wasn't the fact with 19. With 19, it was directly from the start a lack of water in the soil. And so the dry summer brought a little bit bigger problems than in 18 in comparison. So the growth in total was weaker than in 18. Due to this, it led also to very low yields. Then it started, it was quite dry also in the late summer. And then picking started beginning of October. So we started in our winery 1st of October, which is for Mosel in 2019, I would say not late and not early, so in the mid of other producers. The idea was forcing not a too late picking, a little bit like in 18, to save the acidity, to save freshness of the wine, and not to get too high in alcohol potential. We saw already in the forecast of rain that in the long-term forecast that they say we will get some rain mid or end of October. And due to this, when we decided to start picking beginning of October, so 1st October, we directly forced to pick as fast as possible, because the grapes were looking perfect. There was a little bit botrytis, but a perfect clean botrytis, so no secondary fungus, really just concentrated berries, really raisins. So we picked very, very fast so that we could finish the harvest before the big rains were coming. The wineries and basically we were very happy that we could finish harvest again very early in mid of October, before the rain was coming, because we saw the people that still had a lot of grapes outside mid of October, they saw a lot of rain. And that rain really stayed very, very long. So it was every day just rain and really no window to pick the grapes in the second half of October. So we were quite happy that we could finish the harvest mid of October. The ripeness level for us was more or less perfect. All numbers on the grapes were perfect. The the aroma of the grapes were fully ripe. The acidity was a bit higher than 18 in the grapes, which was happy for us because we all know 18 was a vintage with maybe a bit too low acidity. The combination of the low yields in 2019 and the high acidity is something that really makes us very promising for a very good vintage in 19. And ja.
Aber die Säure im Wein ist etwas weniger als,
ja.
als 18.
So my father just said in the grapes the acidity was very good. But in 19 we had a higher grape ripeness than in 18, and due to this there was more, how do you say, malic and tetric acidity. Is that correct? Yes. So you had more tetric acidity, and so the acidity in the wine later on is, in comparison to 18, maybe even a bit lower, even though the acidity in the grapes was higher. But that was just one reason that the grapes were, from the ripeness, they were higher. So the better acidity, you could say.
So could I just ask about the rainfall, because we heard in other regions, obviously, precipitation is different, but we had heard, and I actually was there in the middle of September, and in some regions there were very heavy rains that started in around the 20th, 21st of September. So just to be clear, the Mosel where you are was spared from that. So you didn't have the same kind of precipitation in September. Yours started kind of more middle of October.
So we did had some rain end of September, that's correct, but it was not as heavy as in other areas. But that was also the reason why a lot of people started picking already end of September. Happily our grapes, so for me, there was always two types of grapes in 2019. There were the grapes that from that rain, mid of or end of September, got botrytis, and those people needed to pick directly to get the botrytis or the grapes in before the secondary fungus comes. But the grapes that survived that rain mid of September or end of September without getting botrytis, they could stay on the vine for another 2 weeks, and that was for us a very big thing because. In my point of view, the grapes end of September, when we had that rain, wasn't ripe.
In Bernkastel war Ende Juli, Anfang August Regen, den wir nicht hatten.
Yeah. So, and on top, Karl Josef just said, in the area of Bernkastel, we had some rain July, August, that the area of Loewen didn't have. So funny-wise, also the yields in the 2019 vintage were a lot better in the area of Bernkastel than in our area. For us, the yields in 2019 are in the level of 2017, so very low.
So Luke just asked a question about the yields. Overall, 18. Talking to a lot of growers, say between 10 and 30% over an average, a normal quote unquote year, and so 19 in comparison is much lower. Do you find a much lower yield in 19 in comparison to 18? Was 18 a very big vintage for you?
Yeah. So maybe talking about yields, you have to start in 17. So 17, we all got that very bad frost. The yields were very low due to this. For us, it was per hectare one of the lowest yields we ever had in 17. Because of this, the grapes or the vines in 18 still had a lot of nutrition saved from the 17 vintage. So there was a good growing potential. And then on top, the summer was very warm, and what I said, there was a lot of water in the soil. So in 18, all producers didn't expect a good quantity because it was very dry, and every said, oh my God, another small vintage after 17. But the people really just realized the higher yields in 18 when they started pressing, because the summer was so dry, nobody really expected it. And then in 19, we talking about numbers. Yeah, the yield is about, it's hard to say, but it's in comparison to 18, a bit more, let's say 60% of 18, so 40% less. And it's just a little bit more than 17, so on the level of 17.
Great, thank you. When you're tasting the wines now that are in barrel, and this is a question for both you and your father, obviously, is there another vintage that you would say has similar characters, or if you took two vintages and put them together, that it would remind you of? Just trying to get an idea of what the overall character is. You mentioned the lower acidity in the actual wines, which I think is very interesting. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So maybe I say my point of view, and then I ask my father. So for me, the combination of very low yields and a good acidity is something I have seen in the 2013 and the 2015 vintage. Those are, but in comparison, for example, 13 for me was a year where the acidity was harder than in 13, so more acidic, more citrus, and more green and unripe. So for me, the year I'd like to compare is more ripeness of 15 and body and inner expression of 13 vintage. But hast du verstanden?
Ja, im Vergleich with ja. 11 and 12. It's yes. It's with the ripeness and the acid and the aromas, I think it's 11 and 12.
Interesting. So 11, is a lower acidity vintage. So, and 12 is quite ripe. So more in that direction.
Yeah. So my father also corresponds a little bit to what I've said. What we saw in the fermentation, that when you compare the acidity of the grape juice and the final wine, the wines have lost a lot of acidity during fermentation because it was just falling out in a good amount. And that's also something more or less unusual we have seen in the 19 vintage, that the fermentation took very, very long. Normally in our winery we see longer fermentations, which means up to January normally. But this year we had a lot of wines fermenting up to February and March, and still a good part of the 19 vintage is still fermenting in the cellar. For me, the main reason for this is that due to the very dry summer, there was not much nutrition in the juice. So the yeast really had to be very strong to do the fermentation. And as you know, we are doing natural fermentation and don't add nutrition or so. And so the natural yeast really had a hard job to do in this year.
Excellent. Does anybody have any specific questions about especially this kind of discussion, which I think is quite interesting, the different levels of malic acid versus tartaric acid, and what that means in kind of the final wine, before we move on? Anybody? Any questions? No? Okay. Was there you make wine in a number of different villages. So was there a particular village that for soil conditions or water retention or any of these reasons you felt like was favored by this vintage? You're talking about the very, very dry spring and summer. So
I'll pass it to my father. Or we just discussed it. So die Frage ist, ob es bestimmte Böden oder Orte gab, die von diesen Wetterbedingungen profitiert haben.
Ja, alte Reben.
Ja.
The age of the vines
Yeah.
is very good, and when it's many stone in the terroir, it's not so good. It's more schwerer Böden.
No, heavy soils. Yeah. So
and it's when you go on the hill,
the bottom parts.
Yes, is better to the high parts, and in the high parts, the wine is more with lightness, and the alcohol is trotzdem hoch. Also,
still high, yeah. So just to say it again. So my father says that especially the old wines were doing very well in this vintage. I think it's easy to understand. The old wines, they have the very deep roots, and when we see, I think that's what we have seen over the years. In every extreme year, the old wines are doing better. It's easy to imagine when you have roots that are going very, very deep, and you have a drought. Of course, in 1 meter deep, it's already dry after 2-3 weeks without rain. But in 5 meter depth, after you will never get a drought, and that's where the old vines have the roots. And that's also coming back to the question, what were the better sites? So you couldn't really say that Loewen or Longish or Turnish was better. It's also a question where in the hills. So in the Mosel, you always see, like in Burgundy or in other areas, that it's on a slope, and the bottom parts normally have a higher amount of compost, and they have a little bit of richer soil. And the richer soil can hold the water better. And that was, again, in 19 a big advantage. And when you go higher up the hill, you normally see a higher percentage of stones, less earth. And due to this, the higher parts were bringing the lighter, more elegant wines. But funny-wise, they still had higher or even the same alcohol like the wines coming from the bottom parts.
Dieser ganz junge Weinberg, dass wir den halt eben in Barrique reingeholt haben, weil halt eben die Trockenheit.
And so my father also said, we have talked about that we have planted a new vineyard in the Ridge 5 and 3 years ago. And so that's a really stony soil and young vines. So a combination that wasn't easy in 19. And maybe that's a good example to show that these grapes, they were really looking nice. They were free from botrytis or anything, tasting fully ripe. But after fermentation, we decided, so we pressed and fermented them separate. And after fermentation, we decided to blend it into our Riesling Varidor, so in our estate Riesling dry for Germany. Because we saw that the wine was missing complexity.
So this is the new planting on Rich that is in the very, very steep old section. Yeah. Okay.
So just to explain it again, so 3 and 5 years ago, we have bought new parts in the Ridge. So there was the system of Flurbereinigung, that state system where vineyard plots are laid together, and we could buy more vineyards in the Ridge. We could save our old vines that are still standing. But additionally, we got a big plot in the side valley of the Ridge, which has cooler climate, very cold winds. I compared it a little bit with the city of Neumagen. And because it's also a side valley of the Mosel with cold winds and a little bit less ripeness and more acidity than directly the vineyards facing the Mosel. And it's for us a little bit a future project, but it looks really promising up to now. Yeah.
And Rich is the second steepest vineyard in Germany, so we're the second steepest vineyard in Europe.
Yes.
Mike has a couple of questions. Mike, do you wanna ask here? Mike, you're unmuted.
Did I raise my hand? Sorry, I don't.
No. Do you have a question?
I do not.
Oh, okay.
Did I raise my hand? I'm sorry if I did.
No. It's okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So you said one thing that you were talking about was a quick harvest, that your harvest was in comparison to other vintages. How many weeks is a normal harvest for you, and how fast was this one?
Yeah, I think fast pickings is something we are a little bit specialists for. What really brought a change in mindset for us was the vintage 2011. 11 was a vintage that was very ripe, and traditionally in Mosel Valley, maybe I have to start at that point. Traditionally in Mosel Valley, you were picking grapes starting mid of October and picking for 6 to 8 weeks up till November. And in those times, the leaves were falling, the temperature was very low. So it wasn't really a big difference if you picked grapes today or in 2 weeks, because the ripeness it's like temperatures like in a fridge and no leaves anymore on the vine. So it was really no problem to pick over several weeks all the grapes. So that's where we are coming from traditionally. And then we saw vintages like 2011, which was one of the first, or 2003 was, I think, the very first hot vintage we have seen. And then 11 again. And so we saw that we get harvests more like the Pfalz or Rheinhessen and or mid or south of Europe, and that it's getting more important when you pick grapes and how fast can you process. So we decided to make, my father decided to make big investments around 2010 and 11, which means buying a bigger press and having also everything that comes behind the press, so tanks and filter and so on, in a bigger volume so that we can process more grapes per day. Happily in 2011, especially 14 and 17. So those were for me 3 vintages where it was really important to pick fast. 19 was another one. And so we could pick in 19 now all our grapes. How many days was it? I think it was 13 days in 2019 from the first to the last grape. When you imagine coming from 6 weeks, picking now in 2 weeks, that's really, but that's also for us the maximum that we can do. So we can't be faster than this. But we see that the harvest itself is changing quite dramatically in the years. And something also what was in the past never important in Mosel Valley is processing of the grapes. So the time from cutting the grape from the vine until having the pressed juice in the barrel. Because when you pick the grapes at, let's say, 10 degrees Celsius, of course, bacteria and everything doesn't work as fast. And nowadays we have sometimes days where the grapes have 18, 19 degrees Celsius. Sorry for talking in Celsius. And so quite warm. So it's getting more important how fast do you get the grapes to the winery, press them, and get them as fast as possible into the fermenting barrel, so that you have a time where bacteria can't work. Because we are working with natural fermentation, and without all the additions that you could do. And if you work on this way, there is nothing that you can, how do you say, yeah, if something went wrong, we have a problem. So we can't put something on it and then the problem is solved, you know.
Okay, Abby has a question, and as does Matt. So Abby, do you want to go first?
Oh, thanks. I was wondering, so when you're harvesting that quickly, does it affect the quantity or the quality of the predicate wines at all? Like not having it drawn out, basically?
So if it is a difference in quantity or quality, what was the question?
Either. Does it change the quantity or the quality?
So that really depends to the vintage. So basically, picking grapes, when you pick too early, when the grapes are not ripe, of course it's harder to press them out, so you also have less juice. But that's really like more a thing for bulk wine producers if you pick really, really, really early. But then, of course, at the point when botrytis comes in, the yield goes down dramatically. And so in Mosel Valley, it's quite common to have a small percentage of botrytis every year. And what you see is that the yield is going down over the vintage normally, yes. But it really depends a lot to the vintage. When you have a year like 2019, where rain comes in the harvest, then the yield goes down dramatically every day.
Okay. Abby, does that answer your question?
Sorry, didn't mute right. Sort of. But like when it comes to like in terms of like producing like Auslese or something like that, is that something that you did produce in 2019? I might have missed it in the beginning, but I'm not sure.
Yes, so we have produced Kabinett, Spätlese and Auslese in our normal quantity. And honestly, it was also quite a good year for botrytized wines, but just the ones that you could pick early. So it was not the traditional year where you pick, let's say, QBA, then Kabinett, Spätlese, Auslese, and at the end you do selection for BA, TBA. In 2019, the best sweet wines were picked quite early because at this point the rain wasn't there.
Okay, so I've unmuted Matt. I guess, you know, one of the, maybe you can answer. I'll have Matt ask his question and then a follow up after that.
Well, I was just kind of hoping that you would sort of touch back on, and sorry I didn't chime in when Gabe asked, but touch back on the acidity and how the different acidity from 18 to 19, where if I'm understanding this correctly, the perception of acidity is actually higher in 18, even though the acidity in the grapes at harvest was 19. Am I understanding that correctly, or?
Yes, so in 2019, talking about Carl Loewen. So you have to keep in your head that 2018, we really were looking for, so we were like, maybe I have to start at 2018 vintage. In 18, we talked a lot with colleagues in Pfalz and Rheinhessen that are always picking before Mosel. And all those friends we asked in harvest, they all said, yeah, the grapes are looking good, but the only thing is we should have started picking 2 weeks earlier. And so we decided for our winery to really start picking early in 18, and that really helped us saving a good acidity in 18. So the 2018 Carl Loewen wines had a good acidity and weren't too high in alcohol, comparing to with other producers. And then when you compare this with 2019, in 2019, we have about the same acidity in the grapes, but the phenological ripeness, so the ripeness of the grape, was higher in 19 because of the lower yields. And so the acidity was a different one. And that's the reason why, so in the juice, the amount per liter acidity was nearly the same, like 18, but it lost a little bit more than in 18. So the wine later on has a bit less acidity than last year, but if you compare it, it's just always the question, what do you compare it with? You know, for us, it is just more or less a year with normal acidity.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? No.